One of the things we want to explore here on this podcast is censorship, and right now, anti-Semitism, and what we're being told is this dangerous rise of anti-Semitism is being used as a justification for very harsh censorship. There was some hearings, Pat. We do a roundup on a free speech roundup and Pat posted an article about a hearing in the Senate Wednesday that was pretty interesting, and it was a hearing on two different bills. One of them was the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. Well, the article that Pat sent around was Vote on Anti-Semitism Awareness Act delayed after fiery Senate hearing. It seemed like this sparked more of a debate on some of these issues that we're talking about than I've ever seen in any other debates in Congress. Usually you tune them out because they were so irrelevant to our lives. And I mean, we've seen almost no debates on the weapons being shipped to Israel for the destruction of Gaza. We've seen almost no debate on hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons being sent to Ukraine. But I guess what I want to ask you is, first of all, are you seeing this dangerous rise of anti-Semitism? Because a lot of Jews seem to believe that it's true. I've certainly, members of my own family, I've had these discussions with. I haven't seen it. I've been to encampments at University of Chicago. I was a graduate of Columbia. I followed the situation there very closely. I haven't seen any evidence of a rise of anti-Semitism, but parents seem to believe that if they send their kids to some of these colleges, they're going to be harassed, they're going to be assaulted. So first question is, are you seeing that as a journalist, this rise in anti-Semitism? And then I want to ask you about some of the things from this hearing that were discussed. Go ahead.
I think I can say this with a certain amount of, again, privilege because, I'm Jewish and my father is a Nazi Holocaust survivor. So I don't feel any kind of intimidation on this issue. I feel very comfortable just speaking plainly about it, which I know for most people is not easy, but I think it's a complete scam. And I find it embarrassing, just as a Jewish person that, we're among the most privileged people in this society, but yet there's this huge fear mongering about how unsafe it is for us Jewish people. And I just think it's a complete farce to protect those people who aren't comfortable with students opposing genocide or mass murder, whatever you want to call it. There's a group of academics, Jewish academics, who just wrote an article on a blog called Academy Blog. And they're all professors, they're all scholars. Brooke Lober, Emily Meyerhoff, Emily Schneider. And it's called It's Not Too Late to Tell the Truth About Anti-Semitism on Campus. And what they point out is simply there's no evidence for this scare at all. This is just manufactured. And if you look at how the Anti-Defamation League, for example, calculates so-called anti-Semitic incidents, they include things like students chanting Free Palestine or From the River to the Sea. Whatever you think of those slogans, they're not anti-Semitic. And it's an insult to people who've actually been victimized by anti-Semitism to constantly call out anti-Semitism whenever Israel is criticized. It completely makes completely useless the term anti-Semitism. And a similar thing happened in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn, when you had a progressive leader, Jeremy Corbyn, a genuine challenger to the establishment, a genuine humanist, which is very rare for Western politicians, especially at that level of success, because Jeremy Corbyn came very close to being prime minister. All of a sudden, we got word of a huge anti-Semitism crisis under his watch in the Labour Party, and there's been all these reports about it and investigations, and it's all very dense and boring. But the bottom line is, I think that was a scam. I think this is a scam too, and it's being used to justify censorship, as we're seeing now. And what's funny about this latest congressional hearing that you mentioned is that the reason why that bill is in trouble now is not so much because of concerns about censoring criticism of Israel, but because you had Congress members like Marjorie Taylor Greene pointing out that if this measure passes, cracking down on supposed anti-Semitism, then Christians won't be able to preach that Jews killed Jesus, which is,
Which is a tradition every Easter. I have this discussion with my Christian friends. So anyway.
So Marjorie Taylor Greene all of a sudden felt threatened by the censorship, not because it was. I think it was fine for people like that when the censorship is being used to silence criticism of Israel. but not when it's being used to silence this foundational Christian teaching that Jews killed Jesus. Now all of a sudden we have to remember that we support something called free speech. And Len, I mean, you know this as a lawyer. I mean, the U.S. really is unique in its protections of free speech around the world. There's, you know, it's very, very rare to have the protections enshrined into law that the U.S. has protecting the right to free expression. And now all of a sudden, some people are remembering that because they're threatened with not being able to say that Jews killed Jesus. But I've never seen anything like this. You know, students rounded up, kidnapped because they write an op-ed. If you look at the people they've chosen to go after, these students, these are the models of what's called like civility. They're constantly talking about how we all have to find a way to coexist, that, you know, Jewish liberation is tied to Palestinian liberation. They say all the things you would want someone to say if your main concern was so-called civility and respecting everyone and going out of your way to make everybody feel safe. But it doesn't matter, because they don't support Israel slaughtering their people, slaughtering tens of thousands of civilians, and because they're willing to oppose that publicly and calling for boycotting Israel, they're being rounded up and set off for deportation. And this comes after the Trump administration came to power by accurately pointing out the censorship that was happening under Biden. You know, the censorship of dissenting voices on issues like COVID and the Ukraine war. There was censorship of Republicans. There was legal persecution of Trump. I think all those cases against him, for the most part, were completely farcical. But the Trump camp has now taken that playbook and I think even escalated it, because I never saw Joe Biden try to deport somebody for writing an op-ed. So it's really amazing what the Republicans are doing, putting Israel first and abandoning all their professed opposition to censorship.
And it seems like among Jews that there's some sort of license to criticize Netanyahu, but
Yes.
not necessarily to criticize the Jewish state or the you know, that if you're going to criticize, you should focus on the actual leader Netanyahu and not on Israel itself.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, Bernie Sanders does this. Chuck Schumer does this. You know, Chuck Schumer, it's interesting. He's a lifelong supporter of Israel, but he's called out Netanyahu. And in fact, he gave a speech last year calling on Netanyahu to step down, which was a big deal because this is a major champion of Israel saying that the Israeli prime minister needs to go, especially a very popular Israeli prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. So, but yes, there is this effort to personalize everything into Netanyahu. And really, you know, even when you had, at the height of the Oslo peace process, which was overseen by, you know, liberals, the Labor Party in Israel, you know, Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak, that's when actually settlement construction in the occupied West Bank was at its peak. So it'd be great if all this was just the problem of the fault of one man, Netanyahu. But unfortunately, Israel is foundationally committed to occupying and displacing Palestinians, no matter who is in charge. And so that's why even if Netanyahu left, you'd still have the same problem. And it's a society that has really drifted to the right. I spent some time there in the 1990s. I lived there after high school, actually, for almost a year, you know, living on a kibbutz. I did that program that you do at some North American Jewish summer camps. I did that, you know, and I lived there. And that was the time of the Oslo peace process. And there was some hope back then. And there was, you know, there was a contingent that supported a Palestinian state. But after the outbreak of the Second Intifada in 2000, and after all of that was blamed on Yasser Arafat and the PLO, and they were accused of walking away from this really generous Israeli peace offer, which is, I think, completely baseless and another lie to justify Israeli policies, Israel occupation. You had a real shift in Israel. And now what was called the left is a tiny sliver. You know, there's people like Gideon Levy of Haaretz and a few very, very small groups. But the society, including its young people, uniquely, I think, because not too many societies see a further drift to the right by the younger generations. Usually they become more progressive. In Israel, it's the opposite. But you still have, though, a media that tells more truth about Israel than U.S. media does. You have outlets like Haaretz, which I have a lot of criticisms of, but simply will print facts that will not be allowed inside U.S. media pages. And so that speaks to how there is, in some ways, much freer debate about Israel inside Israel than there is inside the United States.